What's up, everyone? This is Derek Plavin, and welcome back to episode 45 of How to Practice Jazz Guitar Efficiently. Now, if this is the first video you've ever seen on this channel before, I would really recommend that you go back to episode 1 and try as best as you can to watch the videos in order. I know that they're long, but if you really want to benefit the most from this channel, that's what I would do, because this is like a free online jazz guitar course that unfolds in a logical manner and just keeps building upon itself, alright? But since you clicked on this video today, maybe check this one out first and see if you like it, and then you can take it from there. Today I'm going to be finally wrapping up this topic, at least for now, of simplifying the harmony when soloing over chord changes. We can always look at more examples or songs in the future with this type of thing, so feel free to suggest any ideas that you may want me to discuss. So the example today will be the changes for the old standard by Jimmy Van Heusen and John Burke, entitled Like Someone in Love. It was originally composed for the 1944 film Belle of the Yukon, and was also really popularized by the Bing Crosby version of this tune from 1945, and since becoming a popular standard that jazz musicians like to play. In the last episode, we looked at ESP by Wayne Shorter, and although I attempted to analyze it from a really functional standpoint, and still do find that particular tune to actually be pretty functional, it's still pretty harmonically advanced and further evolved from, say, the more commonplace and typical kinds of functional chord progressions that we tend to find in jazz music and popular standards. So I wanted to go back to an example here today that we might say has a little bit more of a traditionally functional type of harmony and has some unique examples of common fundamental chord progressions that we haven't really discussed yet, and I thought that this tune, Like Someone in Love, would be a good example for this type of thing. Alright, real quick, I just wanted to let you guys know that although I don't actually play this in this video, I still made a PDF that has chord voicings that go along with the harmony for this whole tune, and these voicings really consider the melody, and I just think they sound good the way that they're put together. And it's like I often say, if you're ever feeling confused about how exactly to go about making progress when it comes to choosing voicings when you're playing that sound good to you, the way that they're put together, and you don't have to think about it so much, as opposed to just picking any chord voicing that you can immediately think of when you're comping. You know, to me, one of the best solutions for that is to just start studying a bunch of different examples, and the more stuff you start to see and understand, the more you'll become familiar with this harmonic language, and you won't have to think about it as much, and you'll just know the right stuff to do. So if anyone's interested, this is available on my website and on Patreon. The links will be in the description. And in addition to this, I have an incredible offer that goes along with this that you won't believe. And what it is if anyone wants to hear me play these chord voicings, all you gotta do is put it in the comments and I'll make a video. So how about that? Can you believe you're getting a deal like that? So anyway, I hope you enjoy. Alright, so as usual, let's now begin by first taking a look at the form. And it's actually kind of funny because although I didn't intentionally pick this tune for any of these reasons, it turns out that this is another 32-bar form that is made up of two 16-bar halves that are the same thing except for the last 4 bars again, which are your two different ending variations. And this tune is also typically played in the key of E flat major again, which is how we're looking at it here today. So we looked at a lot of examples recently that have the same things happening. And like I said before, it can possibly inspire you or evoke some ideas by showing you different examples of how you might functionally get around harmony that mostly consist of diatonic chord progressions that focus around one primary tonal center, and they're consistently fitting within the same form or amount of time, essentially. So it can show you different possibilities of how you may be able to move things around within the same amount of time. And since we're seeing it over and over again in the same consistent key, it could be helpful for some people by making it more clear when it comes to things that may be similar about each example and things that might make them unique. So this isn't really too important here, just some food for thought, but I digress. Anyway, if we look at the chords that are written here in this chart, which I did not write out again, I'm cool with almost all of it, except for maybe two things that I might write out differently. The first thing would be the first chord shown in bar 3. It shows the chord to be an A minor 7 flat 5 or A half diminished, which I still wouldn't say is totally incorrect. And if you played it, you'd probably be fine. But I would say that in this tune, it may specifically be more of a F7 chord over A, which is really just a first inversion of an F7 chord. And this chord is actually really close to and basically a variation on the A minor 7 flat 5 anyway. The reason why I think this is a better choice is because when you consider the melody at this point in the tune, you have an F natural, which if we relate that intervallically to some sort of A chord with A as the root, that's the flat 6. And if you're harmonizing this note with some sort of A half diminished sound, which conventionally has a flat 7 in it, you can still harmonize it with that flat 7 in the chord. But you may not always want to put it in there along with the minor 6 as well. So if you take a basic A half diminished chord, and I'm going to switch some of the other notes around, but if you basically take the flat 7 out and put in a flat 6 instead, basically you now get an F7 chord in first inversion. Functionally speaking, we should know that both of these chords, the F7 and A half diminished, can go in the same category as functioning as a dominant. We're not actually in the key of B flat major in this song, but we can see that those two chords relate, and F7 is the 5 chord in that key, and the A minor 7 flat 5 is the 7 chord. So you can still basically substitute them out for each other. An example like this is cool because we're using what is normally a very basic and vanilla sounding dominant chord, regardless of the fact that it's an inversion, and we're using it in this kind of disguised way to give it a different application so that it actually sounds good. And if we used it like to compare, like say a minor 2-5 in the key of G minor, you know, we can replace that first chord. You know, it's a different sound. Now, the other part I might write differently is bar 6. It shows to be A minor 7 to D7, and although these changes are commonly accepted to be the right changes for this part in the tune, and you may actually see these changes in various charts as well as being used in backing tracks for this tune, I would say that the more authentic harmony for this bar would probably be to just have a B flat 7 for the whole bar, which would then turn bars 4 through 6 into a basic 2-5-1 progression in the key of E flat major. I don't understand why so many people play these other changes, because if you actually listen to a lot of the classic recordings of this tune by the masters, they all seem to play this tune with the basic 2-5-1, and I'm sure there's exceptions, but this is why you should actually be listening to recordings when you're learning tunes and not just go by whatever the chart says. Now, I want to talk about how to possibly approach these changes harmonically, and I actually want to start at this same spot, bar 6. But before getting into any specific parts, I just want to remind you again and suggest that one of the best things that you can and should do for your harmonic approach to this tune and really any tune is to apply the chord tones and half notes exercise to the changes. Although I briefly mentioned this exercise in part 4 on this little mini topic, I really haven't talked about it since part 1, so I felt like this might be a good spot to bring it up again. The thing is, while I think all the stuff that I've been talking about in these recent videos can definitely be helpful, I think that as you get experience, you realize that there's a lot of things in music that aren't really always black and white or one or the other. I know this can be obvious for some people, but Don't let these harmonic relationships or devices I've been talking about make you lazy and think that you don't have to work on nailing all the changes in time, especially for changes like these that are actually really diatonic. This exercise can still really help with internalizing the sounds of different harmonic motions that can exist within a diatonic melody, so that when you play for real, you'll hopefully feel more natural being able to hear certain melodic notes to go to in the right spots. So let's go back to bar 6. First of all, like I said, I believe that the harmony is more authentically just B flat 7, and therefore when you approach the 2-5-1 that now emerges in bars 4 through 6, you can do the same things that I've already discussed in previous videos. A lot of it depends on context, especially the tempo, but you can articulate every chord. You can take a more diatonic approach and just think E flat major for the whole thing. And you could see the 2-5 part as being combined into one main tonality, either the dominant or the subdominant. And then you would have the tonic resolution as the other tonality to move towards. So there's nothing else really to say on that, but I do want to discuss the other choice that is written, regardless of if it may be correct or not. I just want to discuss this harmony and how it compares to the other option. We're really looking at the whole progression here, the A minor 7, D7 to E flat major, and understanding it from a functional perspective because it's a common progression. Like, for example, you literally have the same exact progression in the same key, A minor, D7 to E flat. In the tune, it could happen to you, right here, so same thing, and it's also in the tune I Remember You, in the key of F, where it's like F major, and then E minor, D7. So this is actually related to stuff that we've already discussed, it's just being expressed in a different kind of way. We should recognize from last episode that the D7, in relationship to E flat, it's a half step below the E flat root, and the tritone sub of D7 is A flat 7, which is the 4-7 in relationship to the key of E flat major. And then if we just put the A minor in front of it, that's just 2ing the 5, which we've talked about. So this is basically a 4-1 cadence. And if you consider the F minor in the bar before as also being in the subdominant category, because the 2 we also put in that category, we would then be able to see bars 4 through 6 as a basic 4-1 progression. I also like to commonly think of this example as being related to the diminished. So the D7, the diminished that's related, E flat diminished, that is your tonic diminished that I always talk about. I still put this diminished chord in the 4 category the way I see it, but it's still a different sound from something like F minor. So you can actually look at this progression in bars 4 through 6 or something like, maybe F minor 7, E flat diminished 7, E flat major, E flat 6 in that case. Putting aside the F minor for a second, one example of a chordal movement that I like that kind of relates to this cadence, or way you can look at it, especially if we include the A minor 7 in the progression. So one way of voicing this, for the A minor 7, I'm literally just playing a regular drop 2 second inversion A minor 7 chord. So it's an inversion, but this is still a stock drop 2 shape. And for the D7, I'm playing the E diminished, like I said before, and then for the E flat major, I'll play an E flat major 9. And those voicings in sequence, they just sound good to me. So comparing the two choices that you have in this bar here, we basically have the option of a 5-1 cadence or the option of a 4-1 cadence of some sorts. And those are really your two primary cadences in music, generally speaking. Understand that while they're definitely different sounds, they're still serving the same function by creating some sort of tension that resolves to the tonic or the 1. The point is, depending on the situation that you're in or what your taste might be, you can potentially use these two different cadences in different kinds of ways interchangeably, if you know what you're doing, of course, but this is because they serve the same function. And you can use different combinations or ways of looking at it in terms of how you get to 1. You can go 5 to 1, you can go 4 to 1, or you can combine them. You can go 4-5-1, which is really related to like a 2-5-1 more in jazz, or a 5-4-1, which is, like your classic blues turnaround. Now, before moving on, you should notice that we have the same basic progression in bars 3 going into the beginning of bar 4. So, compared to having an A minor 7 to D7 to E flat major, which is what we have in bars 5 and 6, we instead have first A minor 7 flat 5 instead of A minor 7, and I know that I said the chord is more of a F7 over A, but that's still basically a variation on A minor 7 flat 5, and I'll explain in a minute, more about how those are related. And the G minor 7 chord that is in the next bar, we know in the key of E flat major is the 3 minor, which is in the tonic family as well. So it's basically being subbed out for the E flat major. So in essence, we just have another variation here on the same 4 to 1 progression. Alright, so now that I've gotten these overly detailed rambles out of the way, it should be pretty straightforward to get through the rest of the tune. So now I want to look at the first 4 bars. And even though we see a lot of chord changes happening here, when you really break them down, you'll find that you can take a really simplified diatonic approach to them that is definitely relatively easier, mentally speaking. So, like I said, we're in the key of E flat major, and the relative minor is C minor, and for the first 3 bars in particular, both of those basic sounds work, and I'm thinking of the triads, but you don't have to just play the notes of the triads, but they just establish a simple foundation in your head. So E flat major, C minor. Now, when you get to bar 4, I believe E flat major still works, but C minor doesn't work as good. And it's kind of interesting because all 3 of those chords in the key of E flat major, which is E flat major, C minor, and G minor, they're all in the tonic family. And the E flat is the actual tonic, so that one's always going to be correct. But the other 2, the 6 chord and the 3 chord, are not actually the tonic. They're the mediant and submediant or something like that. They're just different variations on a basic tonic sound. And the way you could think of it in terms of the triads, like if you think of G minor or the 3 chord, that's basically giving you a major 7 sound over the E flat. And if you think of the 6 chord or the C minor triad, that gives you more of a major 6 sound. So those are 2 different variations. So when we get to the beginning of bar 4, because there's actually a G minor 7, and that may specifically be giving a more particular version of the tonic sound, you may not want to think C minor, alright? So a little over-analytical, but definitely something good to be aware of. Now, the first 3 bars independently are also a good example of a common chord progression that is good to be aware of, where you're basically moving through chords that are relatives of each other and kind of the same sound. So, again, making it simple. So, if we look at the first 2 bars to begin with, we see that they begin with E flat major and C minor respectively, and we already know that they're relatives of each other, and we have a G7 chord in between. And we should know that G7 is just functioning in that key as a secondary dominant chord to C minor. It's basically the 5 of the 6. And we don't have to worry about it too much harmonically because it's basically a turnaround progression. The tonic is turning around on itself where we go tonic, dominant, tonic. So because of that, we don't really have to worry about playing that change if we want to, and we can keep it simpler. And that D note in the bass of that chord is just to give it a smooth bass motion, so it goes E flat, D, C. I also just wanted to add real quick to this that this particular chordal movement is pretty similar to the type of chord progression that we see in tunes like Confirmation, where the first 4 bars, in the key of F would be, F major, then E half diminished, A7 going to D minor. And the same thing is basically happening when we're starting on the tonic major and cadencing to the relative minor, and it's still kind of seen as a turnaround. We're just 2ing the 5 in that case, but you should realize that you could literally treat this situation exactly the same and be relieved, because I know for years I used to play Confirmation and always thought about hitting all those changes You can, but this just makes it way easier, alright? So, as we move along from there, we have a C minor 7 over B flat at the end of that bar, and that's really just to continue that moving bass motion, so nothing's different. And then in the next bar, we have, let's just call it A minor 7 flat 5 for now to A flat 7. And we should also know, because we've talked about this, that C minor and A flat minor 7 flat 5 are relatives of each other. But here's the interesting thing. They're relatives of each other, but they diatonically relate through the key of B flat major, where C minor is the 2 chord and the A minor 7 flat 5 is the 7 chord. That's the relationship, and we're not in that key. We're in E flat major, but within the key of B flat major, you have an E flat major. It's the 4 chord, or the Lydian chord, and everything we've talked about in this chord progression so far is still valid, because that would be like the 4 chord, the C minor would be like the 2 chord, and then the A flat minor 7 flat 5 would be like the 7 chord. So that doesn't mean we're in E flat Lydian, though. When we get to this chord, this is basically a variation, essentially using modal mixture, of what it would really go to if it was staying diatonic. And if you did that, after the C minor, you would go to the 4 chord, A flat major 7. And I've talked about this before, but that chord is very closely related to an A half diminished chord anyway. The only thing that's different, really, is the root note. And another thing about this relationship, which I've talked about before, is we can sort of see the E flat major 7 and the A minor 7 flat 5 as substitutions for each other as well. Like, as if we were in the key of B flat major. We've talked about this progression where if you want to start a cycle, instead of going to the 7, you can go to the 4 chord, whether it's major or dominant, which would then lead to the 3 chord. You go 3, 6, 2, 5. So those chords are also still kind of related to each other, even if it's through different keys in a way. So when you get to this A minor 7 flat 5, you can still sort of think E flat and C minor. And then moving along from there, it just acts like a 2-5-1 that goes to G minor. And you could have done the same thing with A flat. You could have went, C minor, A flat major, and then G minor to the next bar, right? So when we do get to the 4th bar now, that's just our 3-6 progression that is diatonic to E flat major, and it lands in bar 5 on F minor, which is where we would expect it. It's the 2 chord. So if we consider everything I just said and how all those chords relate, this bar now, bar 5, I would say is the first real significant change point in the harmony, generally speaking. And we could think of it as just being in tonic land in the key of E flat major mostly for the first 4 measures, and then we basically go into a 2-5 progression in the key of E flat major, and we've talked about already how to approach it. Now, moving along from that, we have another common progression where we're going to modulate. It's not a real modulation, but we want to go to the 4 chord, or the subdominant part of the key, which would be A flat major. So we approach it with a 2-5, and like I've said before, even though those chords aren't actually in the key of E flat major, they're functioning within this key to basically take you to the 4 chord, alright? And we could approach this just as a regular 2-5-1 and all the things I've said. Now, moving along from this, from here we're on the A flat major 7 chord, which we can think of as the 4 chord, but then it modulates to the key of C major through a 2-5-1. Now, this is a true modulation, but you want to understand how these keys or the movement of the chords still relate, and it's basically related to what I was just talking about. So the next bar is D minor to G7, and if that's a 2-5, like I always say, we can simplify it down to just G7. So now we can think A flat major to G7, right? And like I just said, the A flat major 7 in a way is almost a substitution of like a D half diminished, which is like a 2 chord basically. So it's a related sound, and it's a cool substitution that you can use in major and minor 2-5-1s to basically, instead of thinking, we're not actually playing that, but that's how the chords relate. It's basically, instead of a 2-5-1, you have a flat 6 major to a 5 to a 1. So we're on C major now, and then I still like to say there's really only 2 ending variations out of the last 4 bars. I know this chart shows the last 8, but The only difference is instead of staying on the C major 7 for that second bar there, you just go to F sharp diminished, which is just a passing diminished chord that leads you where you're going next, and it's not really that significant, so we'll just, bring that up now so we don't have to worry about it. But be aware that that F sharp diminished 7 is basically acting as a dominant chord, like a D7 chord that resolves to G minor in the second ending. So if we look at the first ending first, we just saw this same progression in the last video. So we modulated from C major to C minor, and that's just a simple movement. You can do that, go from major to like parallel minor, and we've talked about, looking at things like these simple movements that involve changes like that. So it's like the movement is already built into that progression there. It's an easy thing to go from like C major to C minor, and it sounds good. So now we can go back to thinking in the key of E flat major, and this progression becomes what we were talking about in the last episode. It's basically a 6 chord, a 2-7, a 2-5-1, alright? So I talked all about how to approach that in the last episode, so I don't need to say much, but for now, you can just simplify your thinking to, even though we are saying it's all diatonic to E flat, the first 2 bars there, you can sort of think about being in the key of B flat instead, and then the F minor to B flat, we're going back and we're cycling to the key of E flat major. And then finally, the last 4 bars of the second ending is just your basic 2-5-1, and then a 2-5 at the end to turn you around to the top, and talk a ton about how to play over that, so there's nothing really left to be said. So that's basically how you can approach this tune, and as you can see, it's actually pretty simple when you break it down. So, having said all of this, now I'll just give you a little bit of me blowing over the changes so you can see what it sounds like. So if you've made it this far, thanks. It really means a lot that you stick around to the end of the video, and now I can finally say that we're done with this topic for now. And I know a lot of people like harmony, and I did all these videos because it's still important, and I feel like a lot of the stuff I talked about could be helpful. But for me personally, I'm definitely glad to be done with it, because I've just been concentrating on it so much. And like I always say, when you're really playing, if you're thinking too much about this stuff, it can kind of get in the way and take my focus away from, hearing melodies or phrases and connecting with the spirit and all that. So it's just a boring topic to me, and I'm glad to be moving on. Now, we're basically ready to go into the actual practice part of this channel, because I'll remind you guys, if you've been watching, everything I've talked about so far, most of it, there's some stuff that is legitimate practice stuff in a few of these videos that is very important, but most of this stuff, at least the way I see it, is still kind of like preliminary stuff, or just stuff that is just more knowledge that you would want to know in order to play jazz, but not necessarily what exactly we're doing when we're practicing, and that's what we're going to get into next. However, in the next episode,
hope you're ready for the next episode. Hey,
because I'm just weird like this, and we're at episode 45 right now, I'm gonna do 5 more videos of stuff that will be like good stuff to be aware of, but I think they're gonna be a lot quicker, hopefully, and just little topics, just some clickbaity stuff, in a way maybe to give you before we really go into the practice. Alright, so hope you're enjoying the content, and if you like this video today, I would appreciate it if you gave it a like and consider subscribing, as well as becoming a contributor to Patreon, where you get all the PDFs for $5 a month. And if you think anyone else would enjoy the content, please share it with them as well. So that's it, and I'll see you guys in episode 46.
Swinging and playing the blues. That's what we about.
I try to help you.